A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, we spend so much time looking at the surface level of world leadership. We see the motorcades, the press briefings, and the negotiations, but we rarely stop to consider the actual biological machine sitting in that chair. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that specific reality. He wants us to look at the cognitive architecture and the psychological endurance required for high-level statecraft. He is asking if these people are just built differently than us mere mortals, or if they have simply adapted to a life that would break most people within a week.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been waiting for someone to ask this. We often fall back on the old great man theory of history, which suggests that certain individuals are just born with the DNA of a leader. It is this idea that some people are simply forged from different stuff, destined to carry the weight of the world. But when you look at the actual neurobiology, it is less about a heroic destiny and more about a massive mental load. These individuals are operating under a level of sensory input and decision pressure that is almost impossible to replicate in any other profession. We are talking about a constant stream of critical data that never stops, even when the cameras are off.
It is funny you mention that theory because most people today just see a political figure as a collection of talking points or a target for criticism. We forget there is a prefrontal cortex in there trying to manage 1,000 variables at once. Daniel mentions the idea of forfeiting privacy and being under a microscope 24/7. That has to do something to the brain's reward system. If every move you make is analyzed by millions of people, how does your brain even process a sense of self?
It changes the wiring. When you are a world leader, your entire environment is engineered to remove friction, but that comes at a massive psychological cost. Think about the Statesman profile. You are looking at intense decision-making under chronic sleep deprivation and constant surveillance. In most people, that leads to a total collapse of executive function. But the people who make it to that level usually have a specific type of psychological adaptation. It is not that they are superhuman, but they have developed a way to compartmentalize stress that is frankly terrifying when you see it up close. They have to build a mental firewall between their personal anxieties and their professional obligations.
So, are we talking about a specific personality type? Because I've noticed that the most successful world leaders often seem to have this weirdly high threshold for chaos. While everyone else is panicking, they seem almost bored, or at least very detached. Is that a learned trait, or is it just how their brains are wired?
It is a bit of both, Corn. There is a distinction we have to make between political skill and executive brain function. Being a great campaigner requires one set of tools, like empathy, high verbal intelligence, and the ability to read a room. But being a statesman requires a different set, specifically the ability to manage prefrontal cortex fatigue. Imagine you are on an 18-hour work cycle every day for years. Your executive center, which is responsible for complex planning, impulse control, and weighing long-term consequences, is a massive energy hog. It burns through glucose like crazy. Most people hit a wall by 2 in the afternoon. A world leader has to be making life or death decisions at 2 in the morning.
That brings up the sleep issue Daniel asked about. There is this trope that leaders like Margaret Thatcher or various presidents only need 4 hours of sleep. Is that a real biological advantage, or is it just a performance they put on to look tough? I have always been skeptical of the 4-hour sleep club. It feels like a weird flex.
The data on this is actually quite striking. Historically, many world leaders have reported getting only 4 to 6 hours of sleep. But here is the thing, chronic sleep debt at that level mimics the cognitive impairment of legal intoxication. If you or I did that for a week, we would be slurring our words and making terrible choices. The Statesman profile often includes what we call a short sleep phenotype. There is actually a gene, the DEC2 gene, that allows a very small percentage of the population to function perfectly on 4 or 5 hours of sleep. It is very likely that our political systems accidentally filter for people who have this mutation. If you cannot handle the sleep deprivation, you usually wash out long before you reach the top. You literally cannot survive the primary circuit or the late night legislative sessions if your brain requires 8 hours to reset.
That is wild. So we are literally selecting for mutants. We are picking the people whose brains do not need the standard reboot time. But even if you have the gene, you are still dealing with the decision fatigue mechanism. If you are making 1,000 choices a day, from what tie to wear, to whether or not to authorize a drone strike, your brain is going to start taking shortcuts. You cannot give 100% of your mental energy to every single choice.
And that is why world leaders rely so heavily on heuristics and trusted inner circles. It is not just about loyalty, it is about offloading the mental work. When the brain is tired, it stops processing raw data and starts relying on patterns. This is where the danger lies. A leader who is fried will stop looking at the nuances of a situation and start saying, "This looks like that thing that happened in 1992, so we will do what we did then." They become slaves to their own mental models because they do not have the metabolic energy left to build a new one from scratch. This is why you see aging leaders become more rigid. Their brains are trying to save energy by defaulting to old scripts.
I wonder how that plays into the physiological cost. I was reading about a study from 2024 regarding hormonal baselines in high-level power positions. Apparently, these roles correlate with significantly altered testosterone and cortisol levels. It seems like being in power actually changes your chemistry to make you more comfortable with risk. It is like the body adapts to the throne.
The cortisol regulation is the most impressive part of that 2024 study. In a normal person, a massive crisis triggers a cortisol spike that shuts down long-term thinking in favor of immediate survival. It is the fight or flight response, but world leaders often show a flattened cortisol response. They have been in the pressure cooker so long that their bodies have stopped seeing a global financial meltdown or a border conflict as a life-threatening emergency. This allows them to maintain situational awareness during what we call the midnight call phenomenon. When the phone rings at 3 a.m. with a crisis, they can bridge that gap from deep sleep to high-level analysis because their hormonal system does not overreact. They can stay cool because their body has forgotten how to panic.
But there has to be a flip side to that coolness. If you are not feeling the stress, are you still feeling the weight of the consequences? If you become that detached, do you lose the ability to understand the human cost of your decisions? It feels like you might become a bit of a sociopath just to survive the job.
That is the isolation paradox, and it is one of the most dangerous aspects of high-level statecraft. As you move higher up the chain of command, social friction is removed. Everyone agrees with you. Everyone laughs at your jokes. Every door is opened for you. This creates a feedback loop that can fundamentally alter the brain's reward system. You start to lose the mirror neuron activity that allows you to empathize with the average person because your entire reality is populated by people who are subservient to you. This is why we see that performance versus reality gap. They have to project strength and empathy, but internally they are often in the state of profound psychological isolation. They are surrounded by people, but they have no peers.
We actually talked about this a bit in episode 956, the one about the Netflix paradox. We were looking at the illusion of presidential downtime. People think a leader is relaxing when they are at a retreat or on a plane watching a movie, but in reality the mental load never actually drops. They are just changing the setting of their stress. Even when they are on vacation, there is a military aide 20 feet away with a nuclear football. The brain never gets to enter the default mode network, which is where creativity and self-reflection happen.
Right, and that connects to what we discussed in episode 860 about the strongman era. In autocratic structures, this isolation is even more extreme. In a democracy, you at least have a noisy opposition and a press corps that provides some level of friction. That friction is actually healthy for the brain. It keeps you grounded in reality. But for an autocrat, the removal of all social friction leads to a type of cognitive decay where they genuinely believe their own propaganda because there is no biological mechanism left to tell them they are wrong. Their brain effectively prunes the pathways that process dissent.
It makes me think about the different models of leadership. You have the stoic model, the person who is a rock and never shows emotion, and then you have the high volatility model, the leader who uses their personality and their energy to drive the system. Both seem to require a massive amount of willpower, but they must burn through that energy in different ways.
The Stoic model relies on heavy compartmentalization. They build a wall between their personal self and the office. The danger there is burnout. You can only hold that wall up for so long before it collapses, often leading to a sudden health crisis or a total withdrawal from public life. The high volatility model, which we see more of lately, actually feeds off the chaos. They use the conflict to generate adrenaline and dopamine, which keeps them going. It is a more sustainable way to handle the stress in the short term because they are essentially getting a chemical high from the drama, but it tends to be much more destructive to the institutions around them because the leader needs the chaos to stay fueled. They become addicted to the crisis.
So, if you're Daniel or anyone else listening, and you were wondering if you had the DNA for this, it is not just about being smart or being a good talker. It is about whether your brain can handle being in a state of constant, low-grade fight or flight for a decade without the hardware melting down. It is about whether you can live in a world where your privacy is zero and your responsibility is infinite.
It is about the ability to maintain executive function while the world is screaming at you. Most people do not realize that world leaders are often operating at a level of efficiency that would be considered impaired in any other context, simply because of the fatigue. What saves them is the systems they build around themselves. The best leaders are not the ones with the highest IQ, but the ones who are best at building an external brain. They have a chief of staff, a national security advisor, and a cabinet that act as specialized processing units. The leader is less of a solo genius and more like the central processing unit in a massive distributed computer. They do not need to know everything, they just need to know how to route the data.
Which brings up an interesting point about the future. If the burden is this high, will we eventually see artificial intelligence-assisted decision support systems taking over the heavy lifting? If the human brain is the bottleneck in statecraft, why not offload the data processing to a machine that never sleeps and does not have a prefrontal cortex that gets tired?
We are already seeing the beginning of that. Leaders are being fed synthesized intelligence reports that are generated by algorithms. But the final decision still requires that human element of accountability and moral judgment. A machine can tell you the statistical probability of a policy succeeding, but it cannot feel the weight of sending people into harm's way. That psychological weight is actually a crucial part of the feedback loop. If we remove the stress entirely, we might end up with decisions that are logically perfect but humanly disastrous. We need the leader to feel the stress because that stress is the only thing linking them to the consequences of their actions.
I think there is a practical takeaway here for everyone, even if you are not running a country. We all deal with decision fatigue and stress. The way these leaders survive is by recognizing their own mental limits. They do not try to do everything themselves. They automate the small stuff so they can focus their limited energy on the big stuff. They do not waste time deciding what color socks to wear because they know they only have a certain amount of decision-making fuel in the tank each day.
And they understand the importance of offloading those tasks. If you want to perform at a high level, you have to build systems that do not rely on your own willpower. Willpower is a finite resource. It runs out. The statesmen who last are the ones who have turned their entire lives into a series of productive habits and trusted delegations. They do not decide what to eat or what time to wake up. Those decisions are made for them so that when they have to decide the future of a trade deal, they actually have some glucose left in the tank. They protect their mental reserves with a ferocity that looks like arrogance to outsiders, but it is actually just survival.
It is also about recognizing the signs of decision decay in yourself. If you find yourself making choices based on what is easiest rather than what is right, you are probably hitting that prefrontal cortex wall. World leaders have people to tell them when they are reaching that point. Most of us have to figure it out on our own. We have to be our own chiefs of staff.
One thing that really struck me in the research was how the loss of privacy alters the reward system. Most of us get a dopamine hit from social validation or a quiet moment with family. For a world leader, every social interaction is a performance. There is no off switch. This can lead to a type of anhedonia where normal pleasures no longer register. The only thing that feels real is the exercise of power because it is the only thing with high enough stakes to cut through the noise. That is a very dangerous psychological place to be. When you can no longer enjoy a meal or a conversation because your brain is tuned only to the frequency of global impact, you have lost a core part of your humanity.
It makes me wonder if we are selecting for the wrong personality traits. If the system filters for people who can handle extreme sleep deprivation and high stress, are we accidentally filtering out the people who have the most empathy and the best long-term vision? Are we just getting the best survivalists instead of the best thinkers? It feels like we are choosing the people who can stay awake the longest rather than the people who have the best ideas.
That is the great debate of modern governance. We need people who can survive the meat grinder of a campaign and the pressure of the office, but those very survival skills can be at odds with the reflective, nuanced thinking needed for great statesmanship. It is a paradox. You need a person who is tough enough to not care what people say, but sensitive enough to care about the people they serve. Finding that balance in a single human brain is statistically very unlikely. We are essentially looking for a compassionate machine.
It really highlights the human side that gets left out of the news. We talk about their policies as if they were generated by a computer, but they are generated by a person who might have had a headache that morning, or who is worried about their kid, or who hasn't had a decent night's sleep in 3 years. When you look at history through that lens, a lot of weird decisions start to make a lot more sense. You realize that some of the biggest turning points in human history might have been decided by a brain that was just too tired to argue anymore.
It really does. You can see moments in history where a major treaty or a declaration was clearly influenced by the physical exhaustion of the people in the room. There is a reason high-level summits often go late into the night. It is a test of endurance. The person who can stay sharp for 1 hour longer than the other person usually wins the negotiation. It is a biological battle of attrition. It is not about who has the better argument, it is about whose prefrontal cortex holds out the longest.
So, the next time you see a world leader looking tired or maybe making a slightly off-key comment, just remember the neurobiology behind it. They are operating a piece of hardware that was designed for hunting and gathering on the savannah, but they are trying to use it to manage a globalized, nuclear-armed, hyper-connected civilization. It is a miracle it works as well as it does. We are asking our leaders to be something that evolution never intended.
We really are. We are asking the human brain to do something it was never evolved to do. The statesman is a biological anomaly, a person who has pushed the limits of human psychological endurance to the breaking point. Whether that makes them superhuman or just very specialized survivors is up for debate, but it is certainly a different way of existing in the world. They are living in a different reality, one where the stakes are always maximum and the rest is always minimal.
I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. It is a fascinating look at the people behind the titles. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. It really forced us to look past the political theater and into the actual mechanics of the mind. It is easy to forget that under the suits and the flags, there is just a biological engine, trying its best not to stall.
It was a great one. I love any excuse to talk about the executive center and the DEC2 gene. It really puts the whole concept of power into a biological perspective.
Of course you do. Well, we should probably get out of here before Herman starts explaining the glucose metabolism of the amygdala.
Hey, that is actually very relevant to how they handle sudden threats. The way the amygdala hijacks the prefrontal cortex during a crisis is the whole reason we have protocols for nuclear launches.
I am sure it is, buddy, but we will save that for another time. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We literally couldn't do this without their support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners and keeps the show growing. It helps the algorithm find people who are as weird as we are.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive. Until then, try to get some sleep. Your prefrontal cortex will thank you, even if you do not have the DEC2 gene.
Talk to you soon.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth from man, from long-eared host, my in my